World Conquest 125 hosted one of the largest naval battles that I've ever seen in Foxhole. So I interviewed dozens of the combatants to make a tactical overview of the entire battle using 3D graphics. With the blue team on the back foot, the Green Navy planned an operation to take the island fortress of Aisawa. Two fleets were readied. First, a screen of colonial destroyers and submarines were sent in to eliminate any warden vessels around Aisawa and the neighboring regions, as well as prevent any new ships from joining the battle. The invasion fleet would follow soon after, with its landing ships, battleship, and their escorts. Upon hearing the reports of a massive fleet approaching, the wardens would scramble as many ships as possible to meet them. The result was a monumental battle spanning multiple regions, leading to the largest naval engagement of Foxhole's 125th war. On the 459th in-game day, colonial ships began to mass in Origin and Akrithia for the operation, including the destroyer of the VF Regiment, which was still undergoing minor repairs at the Akrithia dry dock. By the eve of day 460, the invasion fleet would set sail. Seeing the fleet pass by, the GNA's submarine would decide to join the operation. However, a fleet of this size is difficult to keep under wraps. The wardens were already suspicious because they kept having to remove listening kits used to intercept map intelligence being placed by colonials around Aisawa. Then the colonial fleet was spotted by smaller craft. The Trident submarine made contact with a warden gunboat as it crossed into Steema Landing. A gunboat from the LQF regiment would spot one of the destroyers crossing into Steema Landing as well. More sightings were made in the Fingers and Fisherman's Row. Soon, the wardens scrambled as many ships as possible. This would include the GDO regiment, whose main captain was away for the weekend. The stand-in for the captain stated that they remembered thinking, 2 to 3 large ships max, it should be a lot of fun. They set sail with a crew of 9, hoping to gather more on the way to defend a place they called home this war, the Godcrofts. As part of the colonial plan, 2 submarines were stationed at the Morgan's Crossing Bridge, the choke point connecting the main Warden naval base at Clanshead Valley to the Godcrofts region. Once in position, they would intercept any Warden naval support headed to the Godcrofts. Unbeknownst to the colonials, the Warden KRGG regiment would also have a submarine positioned on the other side of the bridge, awaiting any colonial ships that got a little too ambitious. The colonial PvP fleet steamed ahead regardless. This included the CAF regiment's submarine. CAF is a faction-neutral regiment and switched to colonial for now. CAF would soon spot the surfaced CCF regiment's submarine as it was waiting to cross into the Godcrofts region. Unfortunately, it was their first time running a submarine. CAF fired a salvo of torpedoes, striking it in the rear and middle compartments. The stricken submarine would dive to crush depth, and CAF would fire 4 more torpedoes at it, but failed to strike the front compartment. Gunboats and the FLA Coalition's PvP destroyer would arrive from the south just as the CCF submarines surfaced, where they were wiped off the map. The CCF captain would later remark, "I was expecting to die, but not that easily." The CAF submarine would make its way to the Iris seaport to rearm and refuel. The colonial submarine, while its size can be cumbersome, has the ability to be reloaded almost anywhere by crane. In the meantime, the Warden submarine needs to be rearmed at a dry dock, which are typically positioned very far from the front line. And today, the nearest one was beyond the blockade. In the meantime, the Warden 82DK Regiment's submarine had already been at sea as the colonial operation began. They were escorting their regiment's landing ships up the Marban River after a naval landing operation at Alloyd's Bight. As soon as the landing fleet retreated past the Maiden's Veil Bridge, they would make their way to the colonial fleet. The crew was very inexperienced and decided to have some fun while they were taught on the fly. They guessed that the colonial battleship might be refueling at the Tempest Island offshore platform and moved to intercept. The colonials would spot their ship on intel as they passed through Endless Shore. Colonial ships began to respond. The FLA PvP destroyer began making its way back, and command gave the order for the VF destroyer to join the pursuit, forfeiting the task of escorting one of the landing ships for the invasion to friendly gunboats, which would arrive later on. Telephone, a Warden Loyalist regiment, decided to try colonial ships this war. Their destroyer was the first to arrive at the scene, and upon both ships detecting each other, the submarine fired a torpedo, punching a large hole in the destroyer's rear compartment. However, in the heat of battle, they dove below periscope depth and lost sight of the destroyer, which charged in and positioned themselves above the submarine and began dropping depth charges. In the ensuing chase, the submarine would brake erratically to try and avoid the depth charges, but are struck on their port side, so they make a run for the border. The VF destroyer would catch up to the battle from the north, and when the submarine was forced to surface, Telephone's crew boarded it. Then both destroyers opened fire, sinking the 82DK submarine. But with a torpedo hole leaking water into their spawn room, the Telephone destroyer retreated to Origin, where a fresh destroyer was being moved up for them to perform a hull swap, so they could return to battle. The VF destroyer would then travel along the Godcrofts border to support the two submarines guarding the naval choke point at the Morgan's Crossing Bridge, where they would soon engage multiple Warden gunboats. Simultaneously, after waiting for a colonial gunboat to stop watching the bridge, the Warden NWO submarine approached the Morgan's Crossing choke point. They decided to join the battle after colonial destroyers were spotted around Slicken Shelf, prompting NWO and Halberd to defend a facility base that they shared. This submarine had a fairly new crew, as a few members from the Halberd Regiment were training many members of the NWO Regiment in submarine operation, overcrowding a craft whose typical crew size was 7. They had around 12 people on board. Luckily for that submarine, a Warden frigate was reported approaching Morgan's Crossing from the Godcrofts, prompting the CRG submarine to turn around to face it instead of the bridge. As the NWO submarine crossed the bridge, the Trident submarine would strike them with a torpedo, killing 4 NWO members in the front compartment. The driver momentarily believed that they had struck a sea mine, normally placed there to prevent submerged enemy submarines from reaching the Warden naval base, before realizing what had hit them. As they slowed down, a second torpedo would strike, and once they'd retreated past the bridge, a third would follow. The NWO submarine fired 1 torpedo in retaliation, but missed. The NWO submarine would successfully retreat and wait at the dry dock for repairs. By day 461, 0700 hours, the invasion fleet was assembling at the border to the Godcrofts when it was spotted by a single Warden motorboat.
He just slipped through. Jig is up. Yeah, they definitely know we have a long hook now.
Well, maybe, they might do.
Though it was very likely that the Wardens already knew they were there. 2 minutes later, the Horde/73 IQ landing ship would join the invasion fleet.
Oh my god.
What's up, soldiers?
What's up?
Jesus Christ.
Holy.
What's up?
The rest of the invasion fleet, composed of the Trident battleship, the RST landing ship, and one of the 2 FLA destroyers involved in the operation, were all set. And so the call to cross to the Godcrofts region was made. Note that it's very uncommon for an invasion to use 2 longhook landing ships. Back at the blockade, the Trident submarine would spot yet another Warden sub trying to join the battle. Trident let loose a salvo of torpedoes, landing 1 hit. The enemy submarine pushed on as a second salvo struck it. Trident then fired their last torpedo, missing the target. However, the SOBS submarine soon sank due to flooding. The Trident submarine then headed towards the Iris seaport to rearm, so the CRG submarine took its place watching the bridge. Meanwhile, the FLA PvP destroyer and the GNA submarine approached the border to join the blockade as well. However, they were being trailed by several Warden ships. Frigates approached from the north and south, while the H-Ward submarine approached from Perpetua Channel. The destroyer would make its escape as it crossed regions before the frigates could reach it. Underwater, the GNA submarine was preparing to surface to recharge its batteries. But on the other side of the Godcrofts, the invasion fleet began entering the region, prompting many Warden ships to turn around to respond. But the GNA submarine wasn't out of the woods yet. After scouting the western offshore platform, the H-Ward submarine sonar pinged the GNA submarine by the border. After assuming a depth of 8 meters, 2 torpedoes were fired, striking GNA's starboard side. The GNA submarine surfaced, smoking from the damage, so H-Ward landed 2 more torpedoes, seemingly incapacitating the submarine. The attacking submarine decided to save their last 4 torpedoes and informed the command squad of the location of the stricken submarine. The Dogs frigate soon arrived from the northeast, ramming the GNA submarine and opening fire, sinking it. The ships would then head to the east to join the rest of the fleet. On the other side of the region, the RST Longhook repositioned as a single landing craft left to engage the enemy on the beach.
The first
Hey,
and the last.
don't leave him.
We're gonna take
Don't
it.
leave him.
I didn't make it.
Oh.
It didn't go so well. While the under fire invasion fleet waited for their queued battleship to cross, the GDO frigate approached from the south. In response, the other FLA destroyer, acting as the fleet's main escort, ventured south to keep the approaching frigate at arm's length, protecting the invasion fleet. However, the Warden Scum and LQF submarines positioned themselves to the west of the fleet while submerged. Scum would open the attack with 2 torpedoes that missed their marks. The LQF submarine fired a torpedo as well, but as the Trident battleship crossed into the region, the Scum submarine unexpectedly moved in front of them, causing the torpedo to explode at point-blank range, striking the Scum sub in the rear while creating a large hole in the LQF sub's front compartment. Luckily, the Scum sub was struck in its tail, so no large holes were made. The Scum sub's captain would later recount, "Yeah, they were saying sorry afterwards. I felt a bit bad for them, but it wasn't anyone's fault." LQF would later fire 2 more torpedoes, seemingly hitting a landing ship and missing a destroyer as their front compartment was flooded with water. The scum submarine fired 2 more salvos at the battleship, making 2 large holes, one of which was above the waterline. With large holes in the battleship, they retreated to the Orebreaker Isles, and the invasion was cancelled. The scum submarine then fired its last salvo of torpedoes at the RST Longhook, narrowly missing them as they crossed back into the Orebreaker Isles. The escorting FLA destroyer's sonar operator noted that this was their first time engaging in ship-to-ship sonar. The sonar pinged 1 submarine. Then a second sub was detected. The new sonar operator double-checked, thinking that it's just an old ping before realizing that there were 2 submarines. With 2 Warden submarines and a frigate in the area, the captain of the escorting destroyer assumed that they would chase down the battleship, and so ordered the crew to rush the enemy ships to keep them away from the border. The FLA destroyer managed to position itself above the 2 submarines, while the enemy frigate approached and shelled them. Soon, they decided to retreat with the rest of the fleet, as they judged that they couldn't fight 2 submarines. Unbeknownst to the destroyer crew, 1 submarine's front compartment was flooded and the other was out of torpedoes. Both would make their retreat to the Aisawa Canal afterwards. Meanwhile, the GDO frigate's captain, confident that no colonial ships were to their west, ordered sonar pings to only sweep northwest to south. However, after quickly rearming at the nearby Iris seaport, the CAF submarine returned and approached the frigate from the west. They landed 2 torpedoes into the frigate's rear compartment. Without the manpower to stem the flooding, the rear compartment, where most of a frigate's ammunition is stored, was sealed. 2 more torpedoes would strike their front compartment, prompting that to be sealed off as well. The CAF submarine would then retreat northwards due to their low battery charge, where they fired on the Dogs frigate but missed. They would later head to the Conclave seaport to replenish their torpedoes once again. The GDO frigate would manage to limp to Aisawa's Canal, where the Scum and LQF submarines had also retreated to. Scum intended to hide underwater for the duration of the battle, as they were out of torpedoes and the way home was blockaded. Ships such as the Spud submarine with its inexperienced crew along with the Dogs frigate made their way to the east. But by the time they arrived at the scene, the battle with the invasion fleet was all but over. But then, the Telephone destroyer's crew, now returning to battle with a brand new hull, was spotted in Slicken Shelf. The Dogs frigate headed there to intercept, with the H. Ward submarine not far behind. At the same time, the Colonials reported a frigate and sub around the area. The Telephone destroyer then engaged the Dogs frigate alone. But during the battle, the Dogs frigate is unexpectedly hit by a 120mm shell from presumably the north. Upon opening their map, the captain was surprised to see 2 enemy large ships approaching from their north, and after assuming that they were a destroyer and a sub, GDO reported back to the H. Ward submarine, which was still on its way from the Godcrofts. "Oh my god, we're gonna die," the captain stated when recounting the incident. Recently, command gave the order to retreat, so the VF destroyer crossed into Slicken Shelf from Morgan's Crossing to help the Telephone destroyer.
"I'm holding W as hard as I can, boys."
Dogs believed that they needed to escape by making a run for the border to Morgan's Crossing. The Dogs frigate was broadsided as the VF destroyer passed by them, and upon seeing that the 2 destroyers didn't follow them, the captain believed that they had a chance to escape now. Then, 120mm shells rained on the frigate, surprising them until they got a visual on their assailant. A third destroyer, not a submarine that they could try driving past. Seeing their impending doom, Dogs told the H-Ward submarine crew that they shouldn't try to save them, because they would die too. H-Ward did not follow that order. In an interview with both regiments, H-Ward's representative would state, "But we are brothers," as their reason for going in anyway. By 1209 Central European Time, the Dogs frigate would meet their end at the border, at the hands of 3 destroyers and a swarm of gunboats. H-Ward crossed into Slicken Shelf and unfortunately ended up right under the VF destroyer. VF began dropping depth charges as the FLA PvP destroyer closed in to join the hunt. The H-Ward submarine immediately escaped into the Godcrofts region, and the destroyers refrained from chasing it to where they could dictate the rules of engagement. VF then set a course for home, while the FLA PvP destroyer headed to the Iris seaport to rearm and swap crews. Meanwhile, the surfaced Spud submarine was backing up into the Aisawa Canal, intending to help escort the stranded large ships back home. But then, a torpedo struck their front compartment, killing 1 sailor. The front bulkhead was immediately sealed. The CAF submarine and the telephone destroyer had arrived to hunt down the heavily damaged GDO frigate, but ran into Spud, thinking that they were a submarine exiting the canal. A second torpedo would strike the submarine's rear, taking out more of the crew, and after both engines were set forward, the rear bulkhead was also sealed. There was no chance of reaching the Aisawa Canal. A third and fourth torpedo hit, leaving just Spud Erie Rain alive. Scum then brought a barge and gunboat to help the Spud sub to shore, even sending people over as damage control. They would attempt to beach the sub to avoid sinking. Then the last Spud crew member was soon taken by a 5th torpedo strike. After expending all of their torpedoes and battery charge, CAF left to rearm at the Orebreaker Isles. The Spud submarine remained afloat. But while under fire from land-based artillery at Aisawa, the telephone destroyer would open fire on the heavily damaged Spud submarine, finally sinking it. The damaged telephone destroyer then retreated south, with the UBGE regiment's gunboats arriving to escort them. Aisawa now hosted the GDO frigate and the submarines of both H-Ward and Scum, while the LQF submarine decided to try retreating home during a lull in the fighting. The now rearmed Trident submarine would encounter LQF underwater, but both only detected each other once they were side by side, making an engagement impossible. LQF slipped by at full speed, knowing that they would be unable to fight back due to their flooded torpedo room. Further ahead, the CRG submarine, with the mission ending and no new contacts at the bridge, decided to leave. As they prepared to cross into the Godcrofts region, they received a report of the LQF submarine heading their way. They spotted the LQF sub while side by side underwater, and turned to chase them as they surfaced to make a run for the bridge. CRG surfaced as well. CRG fired 2 salvos of torpedoes at LQF as they crossed the bridge, landing 4 hits, nearly dispatching the entire crew. LQF would manage to make their escape past the bridge. Meanwhile, now with some replacement crew, the FLA PvP destroyer regrouped with Telephone's damaged destroyer at the south of the Godcrofts. The pair advanced towards Aisawa to attack the incapacitated GDO frigate. But then, the H-Ward submarine exited the canal to fire a salvo of torpedoes. The first struck FLA's middle compartment, while the second missed, presumably due to the destroyer being nudged by the first torpedo. Now down to their last two torpedoes, H-Ward had both destroyers in its sights. They decided to try and finish off the FLA destroyer, landing a torpedo in its vital rear compartment. But before they could find a firing solution for their last torpedo, two torpedoes streaked towards them from the south, fired by the Trident submarine. The torpedoes missed. Two more torpedoes were fired from the southeast by the recently arrived WK submarine, and missed as well. And so, H-Ward gave up the chase and successfully made a retreat into the Aisawa Canal. The FLA destroyer, now with two torpedo holes, had to retreat back to base. After visually confirming that the H-Ward submarine and GDO frigate were still in the canal, the telephone destroyer pulled back to try another angle to hit the frigate, this time from the northeast. Seeing the trapped vessels, the CAF and Trident submarines coordinated an attack. They positioned their ships at the northern and southern exits of Aisawa's canal, trapping any ships that tried to retreat. Trident fired on the canal, striking the H-Ward submarine multiple times in the rear, forcing them to drive south, directly into the waiting arms of the CAF submarine. They would expend all of their torpedoes. CAF now expected a submarine to move in their direction and used a sonar ping to detect a submerged contact in the canal before firing at the target. It turned out to be the Colonial WK submarine, which up until this point, nobody knew had joined the battle. The torpedo would strike them in their middle compartment, and the incident prompted all submarines to remark their positions on the map to avoid further incidents. The WK submarine was crewed by a very new but eager crew. They arrived after using their deck turret to destroy a Warden outpost on Tempest Island, and intended to help a friendly destroyer. Unfortunately, their positioning made them look like a Warden submarine, forcing them to surface as they made the retreat. Back in the canal, the telephone destroyer opened fire on the GDO frigate. They'd punched 10 holes into the middle compartment of the extremely flooded ship, finally sinking it. Afterward, the now heavily damaged telephone destroyer would finally make its retreat to the Orebreaker Isles. The CAF submarine, now seeing the surfaced and extremely damaged H-Ward submarine steaming towards their position, fired all of their torpedoes at it. The H-Ward submarine finally sank as it attempted to exit the canal. The Trident and CAF submarines both headed to the Orebreaker Isles to rearm for the second and fourth times respectively. Soon after, the surfaced WK submarine was actively engaged by GDO's artillery at Axehead. Motorboats were wedged into the incapacitated submarine to keep it from moving, as large ships can only plow through smaller ships while at speed. Scumsmith Bridge would also reportedly throw grenades into the torpedo compartment, before getting blasted by GDO artillery. The Frog's APC joined the attack, throwing anti-tank grenades at the sub, finally sinking the WK submarine. All remaining colonial ships made it back home safe, and the Scum submarine would finally make its way back to port after realizing that the coast was clear. The battle resulted in the loss of 5 Warden submarines and 2 frigates, whereas the Colonials lost 2 submarines. However, the invasion did fail. A second attempt would be made the next day, and the scum submarine would once again land torpedoes on the battleship, immediately canceling the operation due to the irreparable nature of these large holes.
Where?
No,
You're going
jump
stone cradle.
tonight. No landing tonight. There's too many warden submarines there.
This was the new most amount of time I've ever spent on a single video, by a lot. So don't expect another one like this for a while. But thank you everyone that I interviewed for telling me your stories, and everyone else for watching. Oh, and I recently got a Patreon, so if you want to help me pay my power bill or something, there's, that, I guess. Oh, and I messaged so many people for this that Discord kept asking if I was human. And this time I have a short FAQ.